Lovely. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Chris Eastham, and I chair the Legal and Policy Committee for OpenUK. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar today. Now, whilst she's often the one to introduce our speakers for these sessions, in her capacity as CEO of OpenUK, I'm delighted to welcome Amanda Brock to the podium today to talk about open source in a cloud environment. Not only is Amanda the CEO of OpenUK, but she also chairs the Open Source and IP Advisory Group for the United Nations Technology Innovation Labs, and is a European representative for the Open Invention Network, which is the world's biggest defensive patent pool for defending open source software. She's active within a number of other organizations dedicated to supporting the open community, but frankly, they're just too numerous to mention here. I don't quite know how she finds the time, but she's also the editor of the second edition of the book, Free and Open Source Software, Law, Policy and Practice, which is due to be published in the near future. And we're delighted that she's going to be sharing some of her expertise with us today. So I'll hand over to you now, Amanda.
Thanks very much, Chris. And thank you for having me today. Slightly unexpectedly, as we were hoping to have Cheryl Hung from CNCF, who is going to be speaking to us in September instead. You have the treat of being the second audience to see this slide deck based on my book chapter for the Free and Open Source Law, Policy and Practice book. So I'm actually going to start by taking a step back. And I know many of the people on the call today are involved in OpenUK. Some of you will know a huge amount about the area that you're working in, but maybe not about the overall organisation. And I thought, as I have a platform on which to speak, I might share a little bit about that with you and sort of build some context, I suppose. So you can't have escaped but notice that we have this incredible vision to develop and sustain UK leadership in open technology. And the board came up with this in January. We have a phenomenal board of people across open source software, hardware, data. We also have an amazing group of volunteers, and intentionally we picked the board from people who were outside of that. The board is actually working towards having an environment where we have elections for next year, and that's something that they're working on structuring through July. So we should have some announcements about the future of the board and electing future boards in September. And that term open technology is one that many people aren't familiar with, but it's really important that they come to terms with it and they get to know it, because what that means is open source software, open hardware, and open data. And those three elements are going to come together in many different sectors, whether that's science, engineering, cloud computing, whatever it is, we're going to see that increasing. And I think OpenUK is taking a real global leadership role there, and that we're probably, if not definitely, the first organisation that's been firmly clear that that is what we're all about. Not just software, not just hardware, not just data, but bringing the three together. And the way we're bringing those three together splits into three. And I know a number of people on the call or who come along and listen to the download are going to do this and realise that there are parts that they're involved with and parts that they weren't familiar with. So we do it in three ways. We are looking at building a very loud and visible community. We're looking at making the UK the best place for open from a legal and policy perspective. And we're looking at education, and that's very much last but not least. So in building a visible and loud community, obviously we planned events. Events have been a little bit difficult because we obviously have been victims of the pandemic, as most, if not all other organisations have. And what that's meant is we've moved our events online, events like this weekly session, which have generally been very well attended, and we know we have lots of downloads around this. So we've digitised. This will be highlighted for 2020 with OpenUK Week. And I'm hoping to see all of our volunteers at the OpenUK Awards. Jonathan Riddle's on the call. He is the chair of the awards committee, which have pulled this amazing event together. Nominations for that run until Tuesday, 30th at midnight. If you haven't nominated, I would encourage you to. And that's going to be a real showcase for Open in the UK and the three Opens at that. We have a number of projects that you are aware of. From a legal and policy perspective, we are about to launch a report with OSIR, the European Commission's Observatory, a joint report on the state of open source in the UK. And we are working with the lead of Chris, who introduced me today, and who's also just written a blog for the OpenUK website on a response to the Digital Services Act. So you'll see a lot going on around community and around this legal and policy group. And from that very legal and policy group sprang Future Leaders. And you're watching this video as part of an educational series, or joining us today as part of an educational series for the Future Leaders. Katie is on the call, Rob isn't, but Katie and Rob are the co-chairs of that group. And what they're doing there is having a sort of handover of responsibility. They probably don't realise that yet. We are making sure that in the UK at least, we have educated the right people to take this forward when the increasingly aging population of our legal and policy group get to retirement or become consultants or whatever we do in our old age. I'm sure we won't disappear. We'll still be there to mentor and to advise, but a new generation of leaders is needed, and they will step up in the next few years. And we've started that. This was meant to be 2 or 3 training sessions and has become a full year program. And in September, we moved to look more at commercial and actually at some of the roles people play in open source. But for the next few weeks, we're going to look at community and then move into hardware and data. So there's an awful lot going on. And that Future Leaders group are doing an amazing review of the UK public sector terms and conditions from GDS, CCS and the NHS. And they're doing that collaboratively over a number of people, pulling together different reviews that they're doing so that they're consistent, and working with some of us old fogies as mentors. Now, the third piece, I said it's last but not least, it's something that we have really been focused on, not just our future leaders, but building the understanding and knowledge that the UK needs for the future. We started, and I'm going to say here, I sweated blood on this, and it's hugely disappointing to me that it had to change, but there is a silver lining. We started the year by agreeing with Red Hat and GitHub that they would support us in creating a kids competition, an open source kids competition. And we got Imogen Heap, the double Grammy award winning singer, on board. And we were distributing up to 100 schools, 1 glove per school, to allow them to use the mini glove. And this is the glove in its kit box there, and some promo on our competition. The idea was that they would do something where they would learn to use the glove, they would keep a diary, they would do something creative and share that with us. Now, what we realized very quickly as the pandemic started is that 2020 is not a year to be moving other people's kids around the UK. So our plan to bring them to London, to let them share in a hack day in Red Hat's Innovation Lab with Imogen, just wasn't going to work. We also realized that 2020 is not a year to ask kids to share a glove, and that we had to do something about that. So back to the drawing board as we went into lockdown. We've agreed with Red Hat that what we would do is provide 4 gloves per group, and those have been sent out to the kids now. You'll see the closing date moved to the 17th of May. We had, completely transparently, the aim of 100 schools, and we got 47. Could be disappointed, but we're not. I think in a pandemic environment, persuading 47 schools and community groups to sign up and participate has been quite amazing. Now, it's probably not escaped you that we might have saved some money there in not bringing 20 kids and responsible adults to London. So what we've done with that money, and I have to say thank you to the participants, because they're all doing this on a paid basis, but at a heavily discounted basis. We have David Whale, who is an award-winning educationalist and has been working closely with a school teacher at my old school, Morrison's Academy in Crieff in Scotland. They've been working together to produce a series of 10 lessons using the glove. Now, Imogen Heap, the singer, has stepped up and she's narrated episode 1 for us. And then episodes 2 to 10 are narrated by, I will say, a close friend of mine, Steph Bauer, who's a voiceover artist and has done this for Token Gesture. We have stunning animation for this. It is really funky, it's really fun. It's something that will engage children, and we're already seeing it engaging the children in the competition from journalism. Now, that's pulled together a series of 10 episodes, 10 or so minutes each, and each has around 1 minute talking about open. You know, anybody who knows me can only imagine how excited I am every time I hear Imogen Heap explaining what open source is to kids in the first video. We tackle topics like copyright, licensing, contribution as we go through the series. And it's been wonderful to watch the first 4 episodes go out to about 200 kids. I'm about to share next week really exciting news. We are in discussions with a distribution partner, With a bit of luck, we will know that that's finalised within the next 10 days, 2 weeks. But we have a sponsor who will be announced next week, and that sponsor is going to pay for a version of the Mini Moo Glove to be distributed to 3,000 kids this summer. So the Mini Moo will not contain the microbit, and it will really be designed to go to kids who already have microbits. There are BBC microbits, very, very popular tool, a bit like a Raspberry Pi. It's a little board which has been distributed widely across UK schools, partly with funding from the BBC. And actually 5,000 microbits were distributed during lockdown, which would have been used at physical events otherwise. So we're hoping to follow up with that group of kids as well. So watch this space for us to launch the kids course even in August, 2 episodes a week, accompanying e-zine. We have a teenage influencer who's going to be writing for the e-zine, an agony uncle, and lots of fun activities that can be done offline as well as the work to be done online in our digital summer camp. So it's been a busy few weeks, as you can imagine. Something that some of you are aware of, but not everybody, is that we are also a consortium partner in Ditto, Developing the Open. And Developing the Open is a project creating an EOB system for the NHS. The Legal and Policy Group have been very involved on the governance side, helping to shape that and to move us towards an open chain compliant project. So how did a nice girl like me, a lawyer of 25 years standing, end up in a space like this as CEO of the bootstrapping OpenUK? Well, at the beginning of 2008, I took a role with a company called Canonical. I met a huge number of great people, including Jonathan, who's on the call today, in 2008. And what we did was we were the commercial sponsor of an open source operating system called Ubuntu. You can't have escaped but to have heard of it. Ubuntu is very definitely the developer's desktop of choice. And I'll come back to Canonical more in a minute. Oops. Oh, I've lost a slide here. So what we should have, actually, no, I haven't. I was going to tell you a bit about OIN and about the UN, which Chris has alluded to, also Open Tech Response, but I think I'll come back to that because I've sort of jumped in here. And what I'm missing in this deck, which I don't know why it's not showing, is a picture of the Red Hat hat. So I've already mentioned that Red Hat are a sponsor of OpenUK, and they're sponsoring our kids competition. Now, back when Jonathan and I were working together, Red Hat was absolutely a competitor. Now, you're all going to know Red Hat. Anybody who's listening to this later as a download will also know Red Hat. Because last year, almost exactly a year ago, Red Hat's sale to IBM closed at 34 billion. It has been the biggest tech transaction in history, and it's open source. Now, Red Hat's model is slightly different from the way Canonical worked. Canonical distributed Ubuntu. Mark Shuttleworth very early said there would only ever be one Ubuntu. But Red Hat worked on a slightly different basis. They have a CentOS, which is a server-side version, and Fedora, which is a community version of Red Hat. They also offer free accounts to individual developers who want to develop on Red Hat. And this Red Hat I'm referring to, of course, is Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And the way their model works is they work on a subscription model where they bundle a number of services in a packaged version of their operating system. And that packaged version with the other add-ons is only available if you take a subscription. Now, Red Hat is clearly a unicorn. Its valuation and sale at 34 billion makes it a unicorn in terms of VC valuations, IPO valuations. But the question we have in open source is Red Hat a double unicorn? Does it have two horns? I don't know what that's called, a duocorn? The question arises because Red Hat has been working on this basis for 20 years, and it's a particular piece of software or operating system, bundle of software packages. Red Hat is very, very close to the Linux kernel, which is at the heart of the server industry. And Red Hat is a massive contributor. So their model may be particular to what they do, and it may also be particular to their timing. I may mention later, if we have time, a few other companies that are trying to replicate something along the lines of Red Hat's model. Companies like Tidelift have picked that up. Often you'll see ex-Red Hat employees, when they set up their own startups, will pick up that model because they know it worked for Red Hat. question is whether it will work for anyone else. I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here. You've had lots of talks as future leaders already that talk about open source. And I'm sure, like me, when I joined Canonical, you could all put your hands up and define it. And what I'm going to say to you is, what is open source? Well, it is not a business model, right? Let's be really, really clear. It is definitely not a business model. It is a way of collaborative development. You know, it's a system of collaborative development, a methodology. It is a way of licensing using open source initiative approved, OSI approved licenses, which meet the open source definition. And you could probably still argue that it is a social and political movement, but it is not a business model. Now, when we go back to Canonical and Red Hat, some of you will have heard Simon Wardley talk a few weeks ago. He focused mainly on Wardley maps, but he also talked about what happened in Canonical. He was the director of cloud when I worked there, and Simon and the team are responsible for having taken Canonical to 76% of the operating market in cloud computing in the early 2011-12 period. Now, in doing that, they wiped Red Hat out of the competition. Red Hat had been much more dominant in that marketplace before as the OS, the open source OS sitting under the cloud. And if you listen to Simon's talk, he has a very nifty way of explaining that and what he did, and I would recommend that to you. He is one of the best speakers in open source, and really go and listen to Simon. But what I want to explain there is that we have a huge amount going on in open source, right? And we have companies who are competing in open source who at the same time are able to collaborate. And we'll come to that in a moment. Now, Mark Shuttleworth on a podcast that I really like called Open Source Underdogs. There's a link to it later in this deck. I really recommend, if you haven't listened to it, there are 48 episodes. Pick the ones you want, but Mark's is one of the best. And that's a great series for learning about open source. Mark says that you can't understand digital technology today. You can't understand software by looking with the lens of the past. And his reasoning behind that is that it was analog. Software belonged to the few. A few big software companies ran everybody's software, whether you're looking at Microsoft, Oracle, whoever. And that's not the way it is today. So that past-looking lens doesn't work for us to look forward into digital technology. We're in a platform economy, we're in an open source environment where actually many, many people own the code that we all want to use. The pandemic has brought us through the final stages, in my view, of digital transformation. There were companies who were reluctant to digitally transform, and they have been pushed by home working and lockdown to get those digital processes and systems in place. And what you see with the digital transformation that we've had globally is that many, many companies that wouldn't traditionally have been considered tech companies, are driving to the same goals. Whether you are selling widgets, drilling for oil, delivering food to people's home, you want many of the same pieces of technology. And that inevitably brings us to a point where companies realize the benefits of this open development methodology. They realize the benefit of collaboration, the cost savings, and frankly, the knowledge that many eyes makes better code. So the more companies we have involved, the more diversity there is, the more creativity there is, the better the code. And we have Steve Halvey from Open Compute on the call today. You'll also see that it makes better open hardware, and that's something we come on to in July when Steve speaks to us. But that many eyes makes better code is really important, and it's something that we've seen move from communities in open source to businesses. Now, after my missing Red Hat slide, I won an OpenStack, and some of you will see me waving this trophy about. I've actually kept it the last 8 years. It meant something to me. There are a number of big organizations like Open Compute in the hardware space, Linux Foundation, OpenStack, Eclipse, Apache, but particularly Linux Foundation and OpenStack in the open source software space that have brought together large numbers of companies, many of whom we wouldn't traditionally have thought of as being software companies or open source companies, into a collaborative way of working. And if you don't know OpenStack, it's a cloud computing platform that was founded in 2012. The founding members' legal teams were roped into collaborating as part of the agreement, and I worked on that. I think it was the only European lawyer way back then. There are many Europeans involved in OpenStack today, from a legal perspective and otherwise. And what we saw in OpenStack was collaboration. And we saw collaboration between Red Hat and Canonical, even although we were tooth and nail fighting for the market space in the cloud computing arena at the time. We saw companies like ARM and Intel, HP and Dell, all able to collaborate under the same banner. Now, there's a lot of lawyers on this call. You will understand that that requires a very robust antitrust or competition policy to be in place and to have boundaries. But what it also demonstrates is this open source model. So often open source is distributed, generally it's distributed zero royalty. And then you see companies here collaborating on that zero royalty open source distributed code, but being able to differentiate themselves further up the stack. Back around this time, we were still looking, we weren't fully engaged with the platform and cloud economy that we're with today. And we were still looking economically at something called total cost of ownership. And that total cost of ownership would be something that people who were consuming open for the first time would raise back then with us. And it's a nice way to look at it. So yes, the software might well be distributed on a free license, but it wasn't free. There'd be a staging environment, there would be implementation costs, there would be support and maintenance upgrades, work to be done to interoperate it with many other different systems, build interfaces. And that was something that often got outsourced back to the company who provided the software. That sort of harks back to the old-fashioned proprietary models that are they're dating fast, is the nicest way of putting it. Maybe even that support model that many companies like Canonical and Ubuntu back then relied on was dating. And we'll come to that a bit more as we talk about the platform economy. So what we've seen through the platform economy is a reduction in the amount of staging environment and add-on services for support that might be needed. That the software is often not distributed, there's not the same need to give back that's triggered by the distribution clauses in the licenses. Some would say, in fact, that we may need to revisit the licenses. That debate's been had. I don't know if it's finished, and it will be interesting to see where we go with it. Mark Shuttleworth, who I quote a lot in my book chapter. I learned a lot from Mark and I have a lot of respect for him. 5 years at Canonical completely immersed me in open and gave me a lot of opportunity to learn. But Mark is sometimes very, very honest, disarmingly so. And in his Open Source Underdogs podcast, he says that enabling your own competition with the benefit of your own invention is what you're doing when you're building open source. I'm just going to repeat that. So when you build and distribute open source software, you are effectively enabling your own competition with the benefit of your invention. And he, in an invulnerable moment in that podcast, and as I say, completely honest and transparent, says that financially and emotionally that can be very draining. And I think I probably saw a bit of that as we transitioned from an organization that was focused on the desktop and enterprise space to a platform organization. And part of that is very much around the business of platform and the change in the economics that we've all seen still with the licenses that we've had for 20 years. And I'm not saying we need to change the licenses. I've always been an advocate for keeping things under review and making sure they work, but open source is open source. And we'll come more to that in a second, as you follow me through this talk. So I did say to you that the one thing open source is not, is that it's not a business model. Keep that thought in your mind. Remember the fact that licenses are generally royalty free, and we'll come back to that in a second. I just want to talk to you a little bit about when I left Canonical. I left Canonical at the end of 2012. When you get this as a download, the slides will be available to you as a separate attachment. I'm sorry we didn't upload these with the changes in today's presentation, so I've got a blank canvas. You could be here all day, frankly. So when I left Canonical, I came up with a theory called What If? And I moved into a law firm. It was a very progressive law firm called Origin. I spent 2 years there, and all I wanted to do was work in open source. I didn't want to move to the US, and to do that, I felt that there weren't really jobs for me in Europe. So I would go and put out my old shingle and see what I could do. And frankly, I was too early. I did 2 years. I wiped my face, but an awful lot of the people at that stage who wanted advice on open source didn't have money, and there wasn't enough engagement in the collaborative space the way we have it today. So my theory, and I probably did myself out a lot of a business with this theory, but it is worth knowing, and anybody who's thinking about an open source business should learn it because it's really simple. What if? What if you share this software, as Mark says, and you enable your competitors? What if you do that and they make money out of it? What if you do that and they make a lot of money out of it? And often I could see people who'd come to me saying they wanted to be open source and do the right thing, starting to shift in the seats at this point. What if they make a lot of money out of it and you make nothing and they don't have to give anything to you? Now, obviously, some of the open source savvy understood that there is other money to be made in open source. In fact, I think we've all seen that there's a lot of money to be made in open source. I'll come to that with CNCF in just a second. However, you have to think through what you're going to do and how you're going to do that, because it is not a business model. Particularly, it is a licensing model that you need to create your business model around if you're looking at open source and something you want to make money out of in a business. Now, what we've seen, as I've said, is over the last decade, this huge transition. Jonathan talked to you last week about apps on the desktop, and that is still very relevant. The week before, you had Neil from the GNOME Foundation talking about the desktop and the place of open source software creating a Linux desktop. We've seen faster adoption in the prosumer as opposed to the consumer space for a number of reasons. One, in fact, I won't go into those now. I'll come back to those at the end when I talk to you a bit more about Microsoft. But in that prosumer space, we've seen the cloud and platform environment become the home for a huge amount of open source software. We have seen the value of that increase dramatically. I mentioned Cheryl was originally going to talk to you today. She'll talk to you in September. She's a director at CNCF. She's also a judge in our open source awards. Just looking at this quick screenshot from CNCF, there are over 300 cards for different pieces of kit, different tools, different packages that you would want to use in terms of open source in the CNCF environment, in the cloud native landscape. But look at the values there. Market cap is in trillions and the funding is in billions. So even extracting the bits of that might be proprietary, you are left with massive, massive figures around open source. Now, there are many advantages of open source. I'm just wondering, a few of my slides are missing. Yeah, these are not right. So let me just follow the story. There are many advantages to open source, and one of them is building a business. So I wanted to show you here images of a number of companies using open source. They include companies like Kubernetes, or packages, products like organizations like Kubernetes, like Docker, like Cassandra, Apache Cassandra. There are, then you get into the companies that use that to build their business models. What I have explained to you is that when you build those models, there is a drawback if you haven't considered what if, which is that you go back to the situation where Mark Shuttleworth was in, where you've enabled your own competition with the benefit of your invention. Now, that is something that's understandable in some spaces. We see companies like HashiCorp, where their founder, or one of their founders, Amon Dagger, talks about the fact that HashiCorp wasn't founded to be a business. It was founded as an open source project, and they hadn't thought through later how they would make it a business. But we've seen, particularly around the cloud space from 2017 to 2020, a lot of issues. And those issues come from organizations' business models being very dependent on the old school support model, which may not transition well into the cloud. And we move from the total cost of ownership to something that I refer to as the total cost of enterprise. Now, that economic model is one that a number of us are working on. You can expect to see more from OpenUK this year or early next year, with us looking at how you define the value to the platform environment of the open source infrastructure. And that's something that each and every one of us, whether we're a business or an individual, benefits from. As I said, many companies have built this amazing software, But many of them have also encountered problems, particularly over the last 3 years, and they've shifted in their business model. We saw that start with Mongo, I think in 2017. It moves through Redis, Elastic, Confluence, Chef, a whole suite of companies that became branded Open Core. Now, Open Core is not a new thing. Open Core is a bit like a freemium premium model where you have open source companies which have some code which is not open. So they're not really open source companies. They're software companies that have an open source business model or a model based on open source for part of what they do and some proprietary. Had they been proprietary companies that had moved to open, we would probably be applauding them and lauding them. Instead, they're companies that had gone to market and been perceived as being open source. Now, what that benefit for them was that they were able to get their code onto repositories like GitHub and GitLab, which allow people in organizations, CTOs, CIOs, developers, to come in and take their code free of charge, to avoid the procurement process, to be able to bring the code in and work on how that benefits them. And that enables those companies or the organizations behind that code, that open code on those repos, to scale fast. I think Elastic credit that they've gone from being an unknown company with a few downloads to 250 million downloads in a space of about 8 years to open source. And I'll talk about them in a moment becoming more open core. But what you see is that open source is at the heart of their business success. And this freemium premium, we see it in things like music sites where you will get a free user account, and then if you want more space, if you want more add-ons, you pay for them. And that's a similar kind of model to the open core model, where at the heart, a business will scale using open source. There will be other software which starts life as being proprietary and often is opened over time. Now, I wanted to show you here some quotes from the Commons Clause, which haven't come up on my deck. Redis Labs' response to big tech companies, platform companies, taking its code in a way that it perceived as being unfair was to come up with the Commons Clause. And the Commons Clause was drafted by a lawyer many of you will know, Heather Meeker, excellent lawyer. I do not consider that her finest moment. If you look at the Commons Clause website, it will say it's best not to describe the Commons Clause or software licensed with it as open source. And if my memory serves me right, it takes Apache licensed software and adds the Commons Clause to it. And basically it restricts usage, it restricts commercial usage in the platform space. And that's not something that's acceptable. If you're using an open source license, you can't add to it. You use it the way it's approved by the OSI. If you don't, it stops being open source. There is no way around it. It's not better not to describe it as open source. You cannot describe it as open source. It is just wrong. So the Commons Clause actually was vilified, I would say, by the open source communities, but doesn't have very much uptake or adoption. You won't find it many places because it just didn't really work for people. And it's an understandable attempt by an organization that hadn't thought through what if. And it hadn't thought through what if to the extent that AWS, who happened to be in this New York Times newspaper article from December, but they're one of a number of companies accused of this, SaaS squatting or strip mining smaller companies. And this article isn't focused purely on open source. It talks about software companies generally, but really it is about open source, because open source licenses, as Mark says, enable your own competition with the benefit of your invention. So not quite your own competition for these smaller companies providing individual services in the platform environment, but taking those services and not giving back, which has become known as strip mining, where big companies, big platform providers are seen to have the benefit of it. There should be a slide here that has a Google logo. In response to some of what went on, about a year ago, just over a year ago, Google invited a number of companies to participate with them in a collaborative way. And Google are pretty good at being corporate citizens and working with the open source community. And what they did was they said, okay, we're selling some of your services here. We will share those revenues with you, open source licensed companies. We will help your business model be sustainable by doing that. And that was pretty well received, but it was only initially 7 companies. I need to go and check whether more have been added, but clearly that's something that would have to grow, and it could be quite hard to scale but it is one potential solution to that old support model not working in a platform economy. AWS would very definitely say that they had been unfairly treated. They responded to the New York Times article with this blog. You can see the whole thing if you go online, have a look at it, and they used Andy Gutman's response, and he's very respected in open source. Actually, I pretty much agree with an awful lot of what he's saying. You know, it's exactly what Mark was saying. It was exactly why I came up with this theory of what if you put your code out there in an open license, people can take it. And you may have seen that there should be a slide here with an Elasticsearch logo, and Elasticsearch in particular. Now, I mentioned Elastic hugely benefited from their open source model, and Shay Bannon, the founder of Elastic, writes beautifully in the blog on the Elastic website about this. You can tell I've actually researched this topic at length. Shay talks about how they scaled because of open source and how they firmly believe in open source. He rejects the Red Hat subscription model, which I think we will see more of. I'm not sure whether that model is sustainable in the platform economy for these companies myself. But what happened when they got into a dispute at Elastic with Amazon over this is that Elastic did something we see in open source, and they forked, rather Amazon forked Elastic. And I took a photograph because I didn't think I'd be able to see this just before we started today. And on my phone, I can see it. And it says AWS Elasticsearch Service Comparison, Amazon and Elastic. The Elasticsearch service on Elastic Cloud, I should have my glasses on. The Elasticsearch service on Elastic Cloud and Amazon Elasticsearch service are not the same thing. With the Elasticsearch service, you could rest easy knowing Elastic, the company behind Elasticsearch, is backing your deployment. Only Elastic has the expert solutions, features, and product vision that the mission-critical deployment requires. Now, that's obviously a sales pitch from Elastic. There's a similar in AWS that I didn't take a picture of, and in the interest of fairness, I should read that out too. But it's okay to fork a project. That's not a breach of an open source license. It might not fit with Elastic's business model, but it's something that morally, ethically, different question. License-wise, it's okay. And actually, you'll have heard me talk about one of my heroes over the years, Frank Karlashek at Nextcloud. I really admire that Frank had received 10 million of funding for OwnCloud, was living in the US, running that business, and didn't like where it was going, and actually forked his own company, came back to Europe, and has worked very hard to build Nextcloud. And Nextcloud's on a GPL license, which is no mean feat, but it also has, I think, between 40 and 50 employees and a community of over 2,000 contributors. So it really is a classic open source model and a really good case study for that. If I go back to Elastic, they really were not happy with the way that AWS treated them. And this time I'm probably going to side, if I'm going to put a bet, with Elastic, in that Amazon have used the Elastic brand, and Elastic feel that's a trademark infringement. Now, there's ongoing litigation there. That litigation should really have been moving forward, but has been delayed with the pandemic. But it's something we should definitely watch out for. Pam Chestick talked about it a few talks ago. Definitely something of interest to everybody in this group. So you'll hear me talk about the last 3 years as the open core wars, something that has really been received badly by the open source community, but something we have to think about and we have to find a way forward for. A chap called JJ Jackson uses the term commercial open source. I prefer open core on the basis that I think potentially all open source can be commercial or commercialized, and there's no such thing really as commercial open source, but it's commercial companies working with open source. I mentioned the open source Underdogs podcast. Mike Schwartz does these, 48 of them. He's finished now, he's moved on to another area, and he's starting to do his podcasts. I've picked these two in particular as I think James Waters at Pivotal and Shannon Williams at Rancher have really positive attitudes to how their companies are making money and turning a profit. We've seen Pivotal be acquired by VMware since this podcast was done. And they're turning a profit in that platform environment through relationships with companies, as opposed to just relying on the old support models of open source. I'm going to also share this slide with you. This is something I came across last week with Andy Oram. Andrew Oram, who's written for O'Reilly for almost 30 years on open source, is somebody who's a bit of a guru. And I had a chat with him about this the other night. And Andy's talking about the interaction between some of the big companies and the open source companies, not just Google offering to share profits or share revenue with the providers whose software they're redistributing, but also looking at a closed core, where these companies also contribute on the sort of OpenStack type model or Linux Foundation model, where they contribute to that baseline, and they create software that's collaborative, that they don't differentiate themselves on and differentiate themselves further up the stack. And he's advocating that model rather than open core. So why does everything matter? Why does all of this stuff that I'm talking to you about matter in terms of ensuring that the code is open and ensuring that the support or other commercial model is going to work? Well, there's a book called Platform Economy. I can't remember the authors. It's in my slide, I think, when you see the full deck, which we will upload with the video and onto the website. Platform Economy talks about three things that you have to make something in this environment work and be sustainable. And it's a financial model that's workable, which is where we're focusing on here. But it also has to be politically and socially acceptable. And I think one of the things Open brings is that it's politically and socially acceptable. What we are working on is the financial models to make sure that it's all sustainable. And Open is really the way we should be developing, but you don't have to believe people like me and Linus. You can listen to the likes of Steve Wally here at Microsoft. This is a 2018 keynote Steve gave in Edinburgh at the Linux Foundation's Open Source Summit. It's worth noting that the Kubernetes Summit I was meant to go to in Amsterdam in late March, which was cancelled because of lockdown, actually is now on the same scale as the Open Source Summit, which is Linux focused. So we see the importance of Kubernetes and other software being built around cloud infrastructure with that. Going back to Steve's talk, this is Sasha Nadal at Microsoft, the CEO at Microsoft today, who he has on the image behind him. Now, Steve is in a massive, massive auditorium here, and that is a 50-foot screen. It's huge. And Sasha is asking for us to judge Microsoft by the actions of today, its recent past and future, but not its actions of its past. I know some of you in this call are pretty young, or some of you are downloading it, and you may not have lived through the open source wars of the 90s and early 2000s, when Microsoft's view was very different. And Microsoft's then CEO, Steve Ballmer, described open source as a cancer. Now, Steve explains that journey in this keynote, which is unlike today's talk, only 13 minutes long, and I would recommend it to you. And in short, what he says is they've been on this journey and things have changed at Microsoft, and it's changed for three reasons. Firstly, 10 years ago, customers, prosumers did not ask for open source software, and today they do. And Jonathan, I guess that's where you guys want to get to with the desktop, so that consumers are also in the same place. To give you the same kind of market share that the open source companies have in the platform economy. And that very platform economy is Steve's second point. Steve's second point is that the infrastructure that supports the cloud, everything that sits under the cloud is open source. And if they wanted to have a cloud business, they had to understand and be able to work with and contribute to open source. It's probably not escaped you that they spent $8 billion buying GitHub. And if you look at the GitHub stats, Microsoft is the biggest single contributor to open source today. And that is because they run Azure, and Azure sits on open source, as does AWS, as does Google Cloud, as does everybody's public cloud. And then the third piece, and the private cloud for that matter, the third piece here is the developers. So anybody born after 1989, I mentioned there's a lot of young folk on the call, you were born after the Linux kernel was released, and you're a different generation. You've grown up with open. You might not understand because nobody's explained it to you, or they've explained it in a way that isn't engaging, the wars that happened before you came along. But all of that allowed for you to grow up in an environment where open is the norm. And what Microsoft found, their third reason for change, is that the way that they hire developers, and they need to hire the best developers they believe to do what they want to do. And every company doing digital transformation, whether it's a tech company or not, every company is digital and needs to do this. They need to believe they're hiring the best developers. And take Microsoft's advice on this, the only way to do it is to use open source. So just to wrap up, I've spoken for a very long time. I'm sorry about my slide deck. I think I've told you the story that I wanted to, although maybe in a slightly different order if you listen to the IT Pro version that I did earlier in the week. What matters here is that we understand that the code on which our platforms, on which our businesses, and on which our personal services sit are all based on open source software. Now, Steve, John Laban on my board will tell you that open hardware is critical. And Jenny Tennyson, the CEO at the ODI, will tell you that open data is critical. And OpenUK, we believe in pulling all of those together. But for now, the message I want to share with you is about software. That code sitting under the cloud is open. And if we want to protect the future of our platforms and develop them further and adopt things like Gaia X and work with the German and French companies that are developing these new cloud environments, we have to understand that those are going to be built on open too, and we have to help to develop business models that protect the existing open source based companies, the companies with business models around the open source and who continue to maintain and produce that open source, and the next generation. We have to encourage the entrepreneurs in and encourage the VCs to invest in those companies. So the way to do that is firstly having a model that supports that code, and secondly by collaborating and engaging and giving back, whether that's giving development time, whether it's sharing your code, whether it is contributing financially. We need everyone to collaborate around this. And with that, I'm going to pass you back to Chris. I'm going to escape my deck and I'm going to come and join. You can probably see my meetings coming up now. I don't know. I'm coming back and see you all. That's a lot of talking. There are people born after 1989, Jonathan. Indeed, there are. And they're grown-ups and they're working in the commercial world with us today, which is a bit of a shocker.
Yeah, thanks very much, Amanda, for that very informative talk. I mean, very interesting around you know, how business models might take into account the way that open source is licensed in the future. I'm looking forward to reading the chapter of the book when it gets released. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to put to Amanda now?
So I'm going to say to you, you'll all immediately notice this is on PowerPoint. I was forced to make this deck in PowerPoint for the thing that I spoke at earlier in the week, and I haven't had time to move it. All I had time to do was change titles, and it may be entirely my bad, and I am shamed, but I'm going to be honest about it. I'm shamed that my putting that PowerPoint onto the blue button may well have caused me my own problem. So to use a Scottish phrase, hell mend me for using PowerPoint there, my own fault. Jonathan, do you want to comment on that?
So Jonathan is asking, do we let Microsoft off easy now that they invest in open source platforms when they still have a lot of lock-in with Windows and Office?
That's a really good point. I'm assuming as a KDE developer and somebody in my own case who's just joining the KDE advisory board on Monday, that I should say, no, we do not let them off lightly. We should be, you know, Amanda Brock should be stoned or I don't know, burnt at the stake for using PowerPoint. Unfortunately, these things happen, and I tend to be quite pragmatic about it. Do we let them off easily? I don't know. I think we have to allow companies to transition. I mentioned before that we would be less hard on some of the open core companies, or many of our community would be, if they'd seen them go from proprietary to open, as opposed to from open to proprietary. And I think what I'm going to say is that Microsoft are going in the right direction, and that we should continue to push them and continue to work with them and collaborate with them and encourage them down the right path.
Thanks, Amanda. I can see Jonathan's typing something else. Maybe I'll just give him a second.
We don't want you in the KD advisory board because you've got PowerPoint on your laptop.
So he asks a further question, which is that Canonical and others fail to get much of a foothold into the laptop and desktop market. Do you see any openings for consumer hardware and software now with a move to new form factors and maybe a move to ARM, and how can hippies like KDE work with that?
Yeah, you're putting me on the spot here, Jonathan. I think there's a big prosumer-consumer piece here, and there's clearly a business model that somebody needs to jump into and grab with both hands, which is supporting people who are at home now, who are contractors or individuals working. Maybe for KDE, this is something I'll raise on that advisory board call, that they should be talking to the community about this, because many of us are now dealing with the fracture where we have lots and lots of different communications tools, lots of systems that we're asked to do that. And for you guys who are employed by one company, that's a difficult thing. For folk like me that have multiple jobs, I mean, I have to use Microsoft Teams for the UN's Technology and Innovation Labs, right? So I even have things like Teams on my laptop, poor laptop, trying to work with all these open source and proprietary tools together. And there's definitely a business in helping folk do that. And I think it's that transition that's hard. So unless you're fairly competent, you are now having those problems both with proprietary and open code. It used to be if you were running some of the open source systems, you might find them a little bit clunky and difficult. Huge amounts of money went into improving the UX, the user experience, the UI, the user interface in companies like Canonical. And I think there's this is often overlooked. I am not in any way paid to work for Mark Shuttleworth, which somebody suggested to me recently I was, because I still talk very, very favourably about the work that Canonical has done. Canonical has been an absolute thought leader. You know, Mark's personal investment in that company has created so much amazing technology that we should all be grateful for. It hasn't always ended up as the market leader, but it's driven things forward, and other people replicating that technology that may well have become the market leader. You know, being the first mover isn't always the best, whether you're open source or otherwise. That's something that we need to give him credit for. But I think that the laptop is definitely harder because you're looking at consumers. Now, I'm going to leave you for a second, so can you just talk among yourselves or wrap up? Because I've got somebody ringing my doorbell who I have to hand a faulty laptop to. Just bear with me.
Lovely. Well, I think given that Amanda's got to run to the door, perhaps we should leave it there. Thanks very much to Amanda in her absence, and I'll hand over to Katie now just to close the meeting.
Yes, I was about to say the same. Thanks to Amanda in her absence. Next week we have Matt Jarvis talking about community matters, so hopefully we can see you all there. Otherwise, thanks for joining, and we'll see you next week.